example of how lawyers outside the reimbursement side of the research area have a lot of influence on public health. Now, after that happened, after we in the United States, the NIH, had gotten this patented and had it licensed and had it manufactured, the French came along and said, "We discovered that." And it turns out that the NIH scientists had been working with the French, and the French had shared with him some slides, and they were able to. For 2 years, we fought with the French about who was really responsible for this, and we ended up not making a scene out of it. We had to resolve it through negotiations and split the royalties and the credit for the discovery of the HIV virus. But that's a long story, but there's a lot of lawyers involved in getting it all done. Since I've been in Medicare and Medicaid, mainly on the reimbursement side, I don't know where I'd start to talk with you about that, but I do mainly these days. What I do before, I was a private lawyer, and what I do now is dispute coverage and reimbursement questions. How much you're going to get paid, whether you're going to get paid for a certain procedure or a certain service, medical service that's provided. And there's a lot we could talk about that, but it's a fascinating world because it's usually on the threshold of what's being developed. I mean, the old things are always covered and paid for. The question is, what about new things? Are we going to, Medicare going to pay for them, or is it not going to pay for them? If so, how much? And that's the big question.
My position is a very unique one, working for Chairman Waxman. Just to tell you a little bit more about him and the positions he currently holds, he is chairman of the Oversight Committee, which many of you have probably seen him do the hearings on the baseball and steroids issue, which is probably hearing at this point. So he is chairman of the Oversight Committee, and he is also the second highest ranking member on the Energy and Commerce Committee, second behind Chairman Dingell on that. The Energy and Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over a whole host of health legislation. So anything touching on Medicare and Medicaid, CDC, NIH, FDA, we have jurisdiction over many of those agencies. On the Oversight Committee, Chairman Waxman is also on health issues. So we've had lots of different hearings looking. Most recently, we had one on the new CDC HIV incidence numbers and the fact that they've gone up in the past year. I also had the opportunity to work on a hearing within the last couple of months on whether FDA regulation of drugs and medical devices should preempt state tort liability. And Professor Blatnick was a witness at that hearing. So it's a very unique position because both of those committees have a real impact on the public health. The Energy and Commerce Committee, obviously, through actual legislation. Last year, I had the opportunity to work on the FADA legislation, which contained a lot of provisions that were a response to many different reports from, most notably, probably the Institute of Medicine, finding that FDA's post-market authorities over the drug supply were very weak. So in that legislation, we did a lot of different things to address situations like the Vioxx situation is probably the most famous one. We gave FDA the authority to actually require to add specific safety language to their drug and that was something FDA didn't have before. We gave FDA the ability to impose pretty steep civil monetary penalties on manufacturers who don't comply. Again, they didn't have that authority before. And so we're starting to see some of the changes come out of that legislation, and that's pretty exciting. The Oversight Committee, as I said, we've looked at a whole bunch of different issues. One of the things that I thought was pretty interesting that I got to work on was the issue of phenylephrine. many people may not even be aware of this, but in response to some federal legislation responding to the meth epidemic, medicines containing pseudoephedrine were required to be placed behind the counter. And on the shelves now, if you just go into a grocery store, you see medicines that are containing phenylephrine. There's a lot of evidence that phenylephrine doesn't necessarily work as well when it's taken orally. Mr. Waxman didn't necessarily take the position. It's true, but we wrote a whole series of letters to FDA asking them to look at this and take action if necessary. Ultimately, FDA did have some hearings on that. They've taken any action at this point, and there's a question about whether or not they would have the authority to do anything about it because of the particular way that those products are on the market. But that's another example of where the Oversight Committee was successful in just drawing attention to a pretty important issue in our view. So it's an exciting position to be in.
Thanks. I had actually prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going to abandon that and see how it goes otherwise. Basically, the organization I work for in South Africa, we see our kind of our job as twofold. Firstly, it's to try to do its work. And this is within the context of a constitution that gives the right of access to healthcare services, as well as places positive obligations on the state to realize access to healthcare. So the very first part of our work is to compel government, or to at least make it easier for government to discharge its constitutional obligations. And the second part of the work that we do really is not to wait until government is actually taking its responsibility seriously, but actually to sometimes do the dirty work for government. And so in the field of access to medicines, where I've been quite active over the last 6.5, 7 years, we've done precisely that in a number of cases. Probably the most interesting cases turn on our use of antitrust legislation to try and bring to make sure that primarily through the market entry of generics, and this is many years before the patent expires, so quite creative uses of antitrust legislation to get generic products onto the market. Primarily to bring prices down, but also to ensure sustainability of supply, as well as to ensure that a wide variety of new combination products as well, and particularly in the field of HIV, incredibly important products that would not ordinarily come to market because you're dealing with different products and different patent holders in respect of each of the products. So combination is very difficult to come to market. So a lot of our work has that. Just a couple of things just about the context within which we work, which I think does frame a lot of the work we do. Firstly, up until very recently, we've been working within against a very hostile government, at least when it comes to healthcare. Generally, a progressive government, a government that enjoys widespread support. About 70% of the electorate supports the government. And yet in the field of HIV, in particular healthcare more broadly, it really has been quite a battle. A president who has questioned the link between HIV and AIDS, this week now an ex-president who has questioned the link between HIV and AIDS, and an ex-president and an ex-health minister. What we saw about 2 weeks ago was quite a significant turnaround. The president being forced from office by his own party, the parliamentary system, something that can be done. And a number of cabinet ministers resigned alongside him, allowing the incoming president to effect a bit of a mini cabinet reshuffle. And what we've seen is we now have a new Minister of Health, someone who has been very outspoken over many years, when it was very difficult within the ruling party to speak out on the president's views on HIV. She was someone who was prepared to do that. Quite a crossroads in the work that we've done, in that a lot of the work has been really bashing our heads against the brick wall and really trying to compel a very reluctant government to do its work, and then kind of picking up the pieces. And now we're at a point where we see, with significant changes, we're now having to rethink many of the strategies that we've adopted over the years. in trying to work in a much more collaborative fashion with effectively a new administration, even the
Well, now I'm going to exercise my prerogative and ask everybody a question. So, Linda, back to you. I know that in the last 5 or 6 years you've been doing more international work. Jonathan's talking about the drug supply, which is now really a globalized drug supply, and you've been working a lot on clinical trials. And maybe it would be helpful if you could give us some background and share your experiences doing that.
Really, the timeline for developing a new pharmaceutical is very long. One estimate from Tufts University that is quoted all the time is something like 12 years and something like $800 million in order to develop a new pharmaceutical. And so what's happening during that time frame? Well, there's discovery, there's fuel, or sometimes it's something that because of the structure of that molecule as compared to others, you think it might have activity in a certain disease or condition. Preclinical studies in humans, and what we've seen in sort of the pharmaceutical, the community that follows the pharmaceutical industry and the development of products is an ever-increasing globalization in clinical trials. We still have here in the United States a vast number of clinical trials, and today you have than ever before. You can go to www.gov and see all the trials going on in the U.S. Many trials going on elsewhere are listed there for various reasons. The laws kind of vague, Rachel, but beyond that, a lot of them are there. And why is this? And I think sometimes it's attributed to weak regulation in other countries, and there are factors, but generally speaking, it's the clinical trials are going abroad to have more rapid sign-up of patients, or just to find patients, or cost factors. For some products, such as biologicals, these are products that usually derive from some kind of biological source, human or animal source. These products can have long-lasting cascade-type effects in the body that aren't even seen for a while. And so some of our clients have to do their trials in treatment-naive patients. This term treatment-naive patient means somebody who hasn't had any medication at all of a certain type, and highly developed countries, after a while, people have been exposed to different products, and so just to avoid a situation where there's an effect, because it's something they were on before, you might have to go to a country where people haven't had access to biological arthritis treatments or erythropoietins for kidney disease or whatever. And when this happens, there's a variety of issues, some of which involve lawyers. Like, for our clients, a very fundamental issue is whether the non-U.S. clinical trial site should be under the FDA clinical trial permit, which is called the IND. The FDA is not all that crazy about having the non-U.S. sites under the IND. And why is that? Because FDA isn't actually going out there and regulating. The FDA review comes at the stage where, not the stage where there's an application seeking permission to do the trial. The FDA does focus on that, and FDA will put a clinical hold on a clinical trial that it thinks exposes the subjects to undue safety risks or has absolutely no efficacy, or there's some other kind of concerns. And this is true whether the trial is in the U.S. or elsewhere, but monitoring the trial and making sure that informed consent is actually being obtained, looking to see whether the protocol is being followed with respect to any kind of other medicines the patient could be taking, or do the patients meet the criteria for being in the trial. FDA doesn't do any of that during the trial. That happens at the stage where the product is the subject of an application seeking marketing approval. At that stage, FDA goes out and does audits of a selected number of clinical trial sites, which could be in the U.S., which could be in other countries. FDA recently has made a number of regulatory changes that influence the choice. And So, recently I've been speaking to clients, and one-to-one I speak to clients about this choice they have. Because if it's under an IND, there's one set of rules that apply. If it's not under an IND, then there's another set of rules that FDA has recently changed. It's one way that lawyers get involved. The other thing is that most companies, or many companies, are using outside organizations, companies really, called CROs, contract research organizations, to line up the clinical trial sites in other countries. And one of the things we do as lawyers is help to make sure that the CROs are complying with local requirements. They don't always, shockingly, to me, if I were running a CRO, if I were the lawyer for a clinical trial, we're going into Bulgaria. Well, let's find out what the law is in Bulgaria. Of course, Bulgaria is easy; it's in the EU, so they had to conform to the EU. But Ukraine, the country of Georgia. At some point, I sort of gave up in finding clinical trial laws in Georgia to say, follow ethical requirements. What are ethical requirements? Well, ICH GCP. 15 years or so ago, leading pharmaceutical regulators formed ICH, International Conference on Harmonization. Put an industry at the table, which seemed a little radical at the time, but I as a regulator, you don't know when you're being inconsistent. Industry knows, because they have to do the submissions. They know when the regulators are being inconsistent. If you don't have them at the table, you don't know what to harmonize. You really know when the regulations are different. So that was a novel experiment. The product has been the most successful harmonization venture that FDA has been involved in. Nowadays, something like, what are the numbers? Something like of the safety testing for pharmaceuticals in animals. Something like, these are probably old figures, but benchmark. Something like 70-80% of the efficacy studies, and this is where you're showing better, works better than the standard of care, already approved comparator drug. These have been largely harmonized, even though the FDA is much fonder of placebo studies. Europeans tend to be fonder of studies comparing the new treatment against something that's established therapy because they have the healthcare system in general are very interested in knowing which product works better in terms of Daryl Grinstead area. I want to keep going on and on about this, but that's the issues that lawyers get involved in resolving at this stage. Choices made by clients, strategic choices. And just to give you an idea, one small client, this is a small to medium-sized U.S. drug company that has maybe one or two things in the market, told me they're doing clinical trials in 80 different countries. Just to give you an idea. So one of the jobs I have at Hogan is I'm the, quote, international partner in the FDA group, quote, that's sort of like, and I said, there's no way that anybody knows all the laws in all the countries in the world. We have a good global footprint in terms of 8 European offices, 3 offices in China, 1 in Japan, 1 in Venezuela, don't ask me why, 1 now in Abu Dhabi. But beyond that, obviously we have a growing network of local law firm contacts that we work with closely. We have local law firm we work in South Africa, Bowman Gilpin, for example. And that's how we do what we do.
I just want to clarify so everybody understands, these are clinical trials that may be used to justify approval of drugs in the United States
Yes.
and in other countries around the world.
Absolutely. Because one of the purposes of ICH, the harmonization group, was to try to allow the test to count every place. So the way this happened was Europe was beginning to harmonize within itself at a time when there were only in the EU. It wasn't even called the EU yet. And the guy who was in charge of the pharmaceuticals unit at the European Commission approached FDA and said, fine if we don't sit down with you, because then the companies will have to, they might have one harmonized data set for Europe, but then what about the U.S.? And they brought in Japan, which was a pretty smart thing to do. And since then, there's been a great deal of outreach to other countries, and this the good, I should mention, the GCP standard, good clinical practice standard of ICH, has been embraced all around the world, including by countries that weren't necessarily able agreeing on the document in the first place. But it's a sensible baseline quality system standard for the different players involved in clinical trials. The investigators, these are the doctors that run the study. The sponsors, which generally are drug or medical device companies, medical equipment companies, can be universities or nonprofits or other groups that act to sponsor the trials. Contract research organizations I mentioned are basically agents of the sponsor. Regulatory agencies. Also, the hospitals themselves, institutions, typically have ethics committees, which in the U.S. we call Institutional Review Board. So we have this very tangled web of people involved in clinical trials. And what we do is help the companies make sure that everybody's behaving. Because there are incentives. The CROs promise rapid. You don't want doctors making up patients. This sounds ridiculous, but it happens. We had cases when I was at FDA and was deputy chief counsel, not before I did the international stuff. One of the programs that I counsel advised was the clinical investigator disqualification program, and this is where FDA would either disqualify clinical investigators so we could no more do clinical, or put them on some kind of probation approach where they'd have to be monitored for a while, and you could apply for reinstatement later. And you can find the list of disqualified investigators on the FDA website.
Yeah, just one vignette. My brother had Daryl as his lawyer. My wife worked and was trained by Linda, but when she was doing these cases, one of the clinical investigators who was disqualified claimed that he had taken his data out in a rowboat, and the rowboat had gotten swamped, and that's why he couldn't produce it in the FDA investigation. The FDA promptly disqualified him. Yeah, I'd like you to talk a little about the SCHIP program. I'm not sure our students know it, and it's become a political hot potato lately because of the income qualifications for it. I think it would be helpful if you could explain to the students what SCHIP is, what purpose it gets funded, and why it's such a political hot potato.
Well, SCHIP stands for State Child Health Improvement Programs. Think improvement. And insurance program.
We hope it's an improvement.
And it was Medicaid. Medicaid had a very limited cross-section of people that it covered. You had to be of certain income levels, or you had to be in another program like the disabled program, or something to qualify you as Medicaid eligible. So there were a large number of low-income people who weren't eligible for Medicaid. And the desire was, and I think this was born of your brother and some of his policy people in the 1990s, they wanted to expand the Medicaid program to cover more people. But at that time, the Republicans took over, I think, and there was objection to expanding Medicaid as it was because it was, considered state mandate. So they developed the SCHIP program, which was designed to give the state flexibility as to who they could serve. There were still some criteria. They had to be low-income people, and there was a certain limits on the extent to which parents could be included in the program. But by and large, there was a pot of money. I don't know how much it was initially, $5 billion or something like that, that was available to the states if they could match it at their Medicaid matching rate, I believe, to get more money to provide these services for these low-income but not Medicaid eligible children. The states were very slow to take this up because it cost them money. So for a long time, there was money that Congress had appropriated that was not used by the states. It was sitting there waiting for the states to claim it. But I think gradually the states have improved their programs to cover a larger percentage of their low-income children. But there still remains a lot to be done, and as you know, in the last year or so, Congress rejected an expansion of this program. So I think you'll hear more about this again in the next. There'll be a stopgap measure to health care reform. I think you'll probably hear about it again come the next administration.
Will there be a gap where kids are?
I don't believe so. I think the current extension goes through March or something.
It goes through March. It goes through March, and then either will have to be a continuing resolution or we'll have to extend it. Well, Rachel, do you work on SCHIP?
I don't.
Okay, well, I've got a question for you anyway. Let's turn to Rachel. Rachel, there's one issue that Congressman Waxman has been more closely associated with than virtually anyone else on Capitol Hill, which is tobacco. He is one of the co-sponsors of a bill that would give the FDA jurisdiction on user fees to pay for the FDA to bolster its resources in order to regulate tobacco. Could you just sort of describe the theory behind this legislation and in sort of broad contour what it would do if it gets passed? And it would help if you could tell us where this is in the legislative process.
Okay. I'm not actually the lead in our office on this, but I'm generally familiar with what's been happening. Essentially, the bill would codify in statute something that FDA did in 1996. FDA spent many years, it's one of the most comprehensive rulemaking procedures, I think, ever in agency history, looking at the issue of tobacco use and what can be done about it. They issued an extensive rule with several different provisions that would enhance FDA's authority over tobacco products. Some of those include things like allowing FDA to look at the advertising for tobacco products, require manufacturers to include certain warnings on the labels. There's very little regulation at this point of tobacco. Essentially, it's FTC out there alone regulating sort of misleading statements about it, but nobody's looking at what exactly is it that's going into the cigarettes themselves. So the regulation would have given FDA the ability to look at what is it that's in there. So the Supreme Court ended up looking at what FDA had done in the regulation and saying, you don't have the authority to do this. If Congress wants you to regulate tobacco, it's going to have to do so explicitly. So our legislation would give FDA that authority. Essentially what happened, the House ultimately passed it earlier this year. Senator Kennedy is the lead in the Senate on the bill. And there just wasn't enough time. We passed it just before August recess, I believe, and there just wasn't enough time for the Senate to be able to look at it. Obviously, there's a lot of opposition to the legislation from tobacco-growing states. Senator Burr has made statements that he would have put a hold on it because he has such strong concerns about it. We are hopeful that next year the bill will get picked up again and we'll be able to see it passed. There are a lot of misstatements about what the bill would and would not do. Essentially, as I said, it would give FDA the ability to look at what's in the products, but it explicitly states that FDA cannot reduce the level of nicotine to zero. That's something that would be reserved to Congress if we wanted them to do that. But they could look at what is a less addictive level of nicotine in the different cigarettes and then regulate it accordingly. There are unnecessary carcinogens, chemicals that cause other harm, obviously, in addition to the known diseases, lung cancer. We know those, but they cannot reduce it down to zero. So there are a lot of, this is government getting in there and taking away your cigarettes, and that's just an exaggeration. So we're hopeful we'll be able to this year, and that the push getting it through the House will be helpful next year. So
Linda worked on this regulatory effort when she was at the FDA. I would ask her to comment on this.
Yeah. In 1993, I had moved from the counsel to the commissioner's office to head up a new Office of International Policy. And I think it was sometime in the mid-'90s we issued a proposed rule. Was it 96 or was it 95? I don't know. But I didn't proposed rule. But at the final rule stage, the FDA had received 700,000 comments. And Commissioner Kessler basically rounded up a bunch of us who had gotten away, who'd moved out of the legal office but into policy jobs, and asked us if we would help out. And I was more than happy to help out. My first husband, my late husband, had died of lung cancer in 1980. If I had been asked to work on the very painful, but the final rule, I agreed to my job, I want to travel, and so I remember we made the Russians come over to see us to get mentored on food safety legislation instead of me going over there on like I did on pharmaceuticals and medical devices, because I was tethered to Washington working on this rule. So the a lesson in kind of how to organize of notice of comment rulemaking, because under the Administrative Procedure Act, agencies are supposed to significant comments received. We had the first exercise poured out. What are what are the comments? Because there'd be some themes. Some of the pro-smoking forces would have postcards that would write in and say, why are you banning tobacco, not guns? Or freedom of choice or something like that. And, so you'd have certain patterns. And so, the team was divided up. And there also was kind of like a jurisdiction issue, authority to regulate these products at all, which I was in. I was in the operational group had sort of the easy issues and the hard issues. I was in the operational issues. Statutory things to worry about and some constitutional things. One challenge was for the jurisdictional group was, could FDA do this? And back in 1912, as early as 1912, FDA had said, called FDA at the time, Bureau of Chemistry, to regulate tobacco as a drug if claims are made. If you marketed tobacco, this will relieve asthma, help you lose weight, calm you down, then you could regulate that product as a drug, because these are all therapeutic claims. And this was a consistent thread. There were some cases in the 1950s by either FDA or the Federal Trade Commission, who's principally responsible in the U.S. for advertisements, unless it's a prescription drug, in which case it's FDA, but regulated by C, not the FDA. So that was a consistent theme. So of course the tobacco industry learned not to make these claims, and so there was a basic. But there's other parts of the drug definition, medical, which is another complexity. But in addition to, so there's different branches of the drug definition that turn something into a drug. One is intended to treat, cure, mitigate disease. That's one way. But if you avoid making a claim, you can largely avoid that branch of the definition. Another one is intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. Still an intent requirement, but here you can be silent. Do you intend to affect the structure or any function of the body? Well, the smoking gun for the, to use a bad pun, for the FDA project to see whether the FDA had jurisdiction over tobacco, what drove Kessler to it was, and what's the leading public health? Why should I sit here worrying about which drugs go on the market or not when you have out of 3 smokers' lives shortened because of this bad habit, mostly taken up when people are not adults and are influenced by peers and are not exercising completely rational choice. I'm from Kentucky, and I was a dumb smoker for a number of years before I saw the light and quit. So this was Kessler's book called The Question of Intent, and that was the discovery of files inside tobacco companies showing that the companies intended to hook kids and keep them hooked. So you get them hooked, and then you sell them the product that they need in order to satisfy their addiction. And there were internal records showing that this intent existed. So that was the jurisdictional group, and we had, during the time period I was working the rule, we had some interesting things like, what's the movie, The Insider? Insider. After the close of the comment period on the regulation, which we had a very short comment period, I think it was there 60 days or maybe the NAFTA 75 days. The Insider, I forget his name, was...
Well, there were two.
Russell Crowe? Yeah.
One of them was Merrill Williams, who we represented, and then there was the more senior guy at...
starts with a W?
Bill Cosby.
Yeah, but suddenly he went public, and this was kind of, when you're doing an agency rulemaking, and you want to have as many facts as possible to support your action, there's a way to have non-public information you're relying on, but it's kind of weak from the administrative law standpoint. After the close of the comment period, this guy was willing to go public, and so I was consulted as the leading FDA administrative law lawyer.
Jeffrey Wygant.
Wygant, thank you. How can we bring in action that he's now willing to have be public? Well, the way you do this as an administrative lawyer working for the federal government, you reopen the comment period. So we decided we would, because we didn't want there to be any procedural challenges to the regs. If you look at, things have gotten worse. I was just reading Professor Vladik's article about the loss of FDA deference. But, there was a time when FDA was largely deferred to on matters of scientific fact. If the agency got shot down in court, it was mostly because of poor rulemaking procedure. And I didn't want this rulemaking, which I'd gotten called back to work on, to get shot down because of poor procedure. So we reopened the comment period on a limited number of documents. We kind of did a sweep of the team. Are there other things? We put a few other things. We reopened the comment period for a limited period of 30 days, and then, included in the comments on the final rule, whatever people said about the writing stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So, months later, we published the final rule. We deal with all the hard issues, drug versus device jurisdiction, First Amendment issues having to do with control. We targeted our controls to kids, thinking, from a First Amendment standpoint, there's more permission to restrict messages, information to kids than to other people. And then, later with breathlessly, I opened the industry brief. Did they find anything wrong with the procedure? No, they didn't. Footnote: I do think we should have. There's a way we could have argued better to Justice O'Connor. She was a swing vote on this. It was a 5-4 decision, and if I had more say in how we crafted the argument. This isn't radical. This is a continuation. Remember 1912? The only thing we're not changing our position on FDA jurisdiction. We're just saying that we have a basis not only on that branch of the definition that deals with intended to treat, cure, mitigate, but also the part about intended to affect structure, function. This is not a radical break. Other members of the team felt, well, that looks like we're not doing something important. I'd rather win than make a splash.
Rachel has to leave in about 10 minutes. I want to get to John, but I want to ask Rachel one last question and ask her what she's working on these days. And then we will bid her do. So.
Probably the thing that's taking up most of my time recently is sort of a follow-up to the hearing that we had in the Oversight Committee on the question of whether or not FDA regulation of drugs and medical devices should preempt state lawsuits. So whether or not consumers who are injured by those products should be able to go into court and sue and be compensated for their injuries as a result. As many of you probably know, the Supreme Court earlier this year in the Regal versus Medtronic case held that for certain medical devices, the PMA medical devices, so those are things like defibrillators, heart valves, that for those devices, if you're injured, you can no longer sue. And they base that decision on the concept that FDA spends a lot of time litigating, and we shouldn't have state courts and juries second-guessing FDA's judgments about that. Mr. Waxman and Mr. Colloquium have legislation that would essentially reverse that. And we're very concerned about it for many reasons. One of the chief reasons is that we see state tort liability as serving the very important function of being an incentive to manufacturers to continue to look at the safety of their devices after they're on the market. I'm sure we've all heard the stories recently about how under-resourced the FDA is right now. We have all these food safety crises, lots of different problems there. That's partly a problem of resources at FDA, but it's also partly a problem just of the nature of the approval system. We don't have a government-run approval system. The companies are out there doing their own testing of their own products, and so they're always going to be in a position of knowing more about the product than FDA, in our view. So we think that wiping out consumers' ability to sue when they're injured for their injuries, that's a very concerning trend. The Supreme Court in that case looked specifically at some language in the statute that was an express preemption clause that, in our view, did not get at the question of whether or not consumers should be able to. It was enacted at a time when, in 1976, when FDA was essentially not regulating medical devices at all. So several states had sort of stepped in to fill the gaps, and they had state-run, state regulatory systems. So, for example, California was one, and California would say, if you want to sell a medical device in California, it has to have, the following aspects of the device. So that language that was put in the statute, in our view, was meant to say we want one system for regulating what actually happens with the medical device. But that was not addressing the separate question of whether or not individual consumers should have the right to sue. So that's going to be a major priority for my boss next year, and we're spending a lot of time working, trying to get a lot of co-sponsors on that. Senator Kennedy is the sponsor in the Senate, and they've got quite a few over there, too. So I'd say that's the issue that's taking up most of my time. We also have an investigation going in the Oversight Committee just into FDA's current position on preemption, which is under this administration. So they've sort of shifted, and Professor Sladek has done quite a bit of writing on this. They are now siding with industry to be thrown out because they think that it interferes with their regulation of the devices and drugs. Up until this administration, their position had consistently been that these lawsuits actually provide a valuable complement to their regulation by bringing safety information to light that they may not have even seen before. So we're looking into what happened to create that kind of a shift in the administration's position. So very busy with both of those.
So is this a good time to take a short break?
Well, it does make sense, but then when we get to the issues. So why don't we take a break? Why don't we say, at almost 4:30, why don't we take a 5-minute break or so? Let's start off 4:35, no later than 4:40. It's fine.
I'm good. Now I have to wait. Yeah, they started doing something else. I think I just got
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't we get started if get our panelists back up here and ask everybody to take a seat.
Yeah, her rights
Well, it was a great first half of the session, Carol. Thank you. Why don't we? We've got about 50 minutes here, and I guess I just leave it to Professor Black at the right point to open it up to questions.
Right, I've got a couple.
The students are in the first couple of rows.
Right, I've got a couple more questions for our panelists, and then I'd like to save plenty of time for the students to ask questions. I'd like to turn to John at the now. Linda talked about the globalization of the pharmaceutical industry, the clinical trials. How does that have an impact on a country like South Africa? Domestically, what does that mean for you? Do the IP issues come to roost in South Africa, and how do you deal with that sort of problem? So you have the waterfront.
I made a Sarah Palin on you. But
Okay.
I'll let you into the first part and then come back to that. For me, the interesting thing about about clinical trials is that a lot of the work that we do back home is it doesn't matter where the trials have taken place, where there's good science out there. As an NGO, and what I didn't mention earlier was we work very closely with a mass-based organization called the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa. A membership-based organization of more than 12,000 members across the country. Really is the premier civil society organization fighting for the rights of people living with HIV and increasingly fighting for a decent healthcare system for everyone. And so one of the goals that we have working with our partners in TAC is to try and translate clinical trial findings and scientific research into policy. And I guess as anyone knows, anyone working in kind of in the fields of policy, that often public policy has nothing to do with what the evidence says. And for us, that's been incredibly frustrating. And I'll give you a few examples. One was actually an NIH-funded study that took place in Uganda, the HivNet-012 study, which was one of the crucial trials looking at the use of the drug nevirapine, originally approved as a treatment for HIV, but the use of it, single dose given to the mother within labor, single dose given to the child after birth, to reduce the risk of HIV transmission. And so a lot of the work that we did, and it's now the subject of, or was the subject of a constitutional court case and quite a famous decision, was to get government, to compel government to implement a program to prevent transmission of HIV from mother to child. Since that decision, a lot of the work over the years has been to try and improve that regimen, because that study really looked at the bare minimum. What is the bare intervention you can provide in a resource-poor setting? And you get resource-poor settings and you get resource-poor settings. And South Africa is not a poor country. And I like to describe it as a wealthy country with poor people. And certainly by August 2006, the protocols recommended by the World Health Organization had shifted. And what was implemented as a result of that court case based on that HivNet-012 study, really the standard of care that WHO was promoting. And so a lot of the work was in trying to push government to adopt a better protocol. There were threats of litigation, some lovely letters of demand sent off to our former health minister, and eventually the matter was resolved through our National AIDS Council, and we now do have a new protocol, not in line with WHO guidelines, but certainly much better than what we've seen. And the data the interim data that we've seen in Johannesburg, in one of the big mother and child hospitals, shows that transmission rates, as a result of the new protocol coming in, have dropped significantly. Still way above where they need to be, but have dropped significantly. Another area, and this was there are two other talks, just very briefly I will touch on. One was a study that I think was USAID funded, I'm not sure, at two different sites in South Africa. One out of the university where my organization used to be based in Johannesburg, and also the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, looking at immediate treatment for infants born with HIV, as opposed to waiting until their immune systems decline to a particular level. And that study, which was stopped before it was completed because the results were so good, and it was found it would be unethical not to offer the intervention to the other arm of the study, showed a 75% reduction in mortality. If you can identify pregnant women early, make sure that you test, using the best technology available, you test infants at 4 weeks, and those who are positive, you get them on treatment at 7 weeks, as opposed to waiting. You reduce mortality by 75%. The US guidelines have shifted based on clinical research done in South Africa. South Africa's guidelines haven't yet shifted. So that's an area where we need to push. And then the final point, which I'd raised to you earlier, the issue of voluntary medical male circumcision. Also, three studies done. One of them done in South Africa, outside in the part of Soweto. One done in Kenya, one done in Uganda, showing between a 50 and 60% decrease of transmission from woman to man as a result of voluntary medical male circumcision. And we don't even have a policy on this yet. There's now a big push to try and get government to adopt a policy. Interestingly, many other African countries with much less than we have and with much weaker health systems have moved streets ahead and are already implementing this program. So that was the very first part of it. I don't know if you want me to touch on the IP stuff.
Why don't you? I think this is an issue that the students have heard something about and will come back to.
I think we're in a very different position from where you are in the US, because what happens that doesn't happen in a country like South Africa, I think has, in terms of intellectual property protections, in terms of the standards, I believe has very little to do with global innovation. Africa accounts for, I think it's about 1.5% of the global pharmaceutical market. South Africa, I think, is about 0.6% of the global market. And really, our position as an organization has always been that what the laws look like in our country really doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with whether or not a company based in New Jersey or outside of Chicago or wherever they're based is going to be investing money in research and development. Certainly, the markets that matter, what the intellectual property laws look like there, is going to have a big impact on those decisions. And so for us, it's been very much about trying to, as far as make use of the space that we have in terms of international trade, or the space being significant since the adoption of the TRIPS agreement by the World Trade Organization in 1995, for countries to implement what are known as the public health safeguards and the TRIPS flexibilities. And so a lot of our work has been trying to, and here we're dealing with products that have already come to market. We're not talking with are still going through the products, such whether it's or vaccines or anything of that sort, in trying to increase access to products that are already on the market. And we've had some success. But as I touched on earlier, the biggest problem has been really an unwilling government that, for whatever reason, whether it's undue pressure that comes from this city, in the USDR in particular, whether it's a belief that if you start weakening intellectual property protections, even in line with what the WTO allows you to do, is going to have some kind of adverse effect on foreign direct investment. We haven't seen great FDI anyways in the country. There certainly is a strong reluctance of the government to try and take advantage of the kinds of steps that we've seen in countries like Thailand and Brazil. Certainly in South Africa, we haven't seen. I think what has complicated matters even worse is that the big push for access to medicines in South Africa and in many parts of the world has been led by AIDS activists. And in a context of very high levels of denialism about the link between HIV and AIDS. Access to medicines and access to HIV medicines have basically been very hard to separate them out. And so that may also have played a strong role in our government's reluctance. We'll see now that we kind of have a first time in a long time a decent health minister, whether we're going to see some kind of shifts on those issues.
Yeah, thank you. Darryl, I want to ask you a question about the Medicaid program. It's always been politically controversial. I think it would be interesting to our students to hear you critique it, where it's worked well, where it hasn't. Is it just a breeding ground for waste, fraud, and abuse, all of the kinds of sort of classic critiques that you hear, particularly when there's a presidential election and every candidate claims that they can save tens of billions of dollars simply by rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse?
Well, there's Medicaid is now almost 45 years old, something like that. But just to give you a basic structure of how it works, the federal government matches states' expenditures for Medicaid according to a formula depending upon how rich the state is. You know, poor states like Louisiana get 80%, rich get 50% federal matching. And there's states have some discretion to choose what services are going to provide, who's going to be eligible, and so forth. But within that basic structure and what's put forth in the state plan, the federal government will pay its match accordingly. There have been various types of scams and things over the years that have cost the federal government and the states a lot of money. Back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they had what were called Medicaid bills in the big cities, and these guys were just churning out bills, sending them to the state, and the state didn't know whether the people had gotten any services or not, but they paid the bills. But those things were put down gradually, and the federal government started supporting what are called Medicaid fraud control units in all the states. So now there are lots of people out there working to control this kind of fraud. But probably the biggest and most expensive scam that was worked on the Medicaid program was done by the states themselves. Because in the 1980s, late 80s, the states determined that there was a way they could get uncontrolled amounts of money from the federal government under Medicaid. And Medicaid has a subsidiary program called the Disproportionate Share Hospital Program. And it has no control on how, it had at that time, it had no control on how much the state would pay for it, how much the feds would match the states doing it. So the state said, we could put in a claim for so much money, pay some of it to the hospital, and take some of that money to pay us back for what we have contributed, essentially reducing the federal match to 100%, and the state's contribution to nothing. And the states found out about this, and John was I don't know if you know, he was a Fed at one time. But, John was at that time the head of our intergovernmental relations office. And he had a lot of negotiations to do with the states, but we gradually closed that down. But I mean, the states ripped the federal government off for billions and billions of dollars before. In fact, it's still going on to some extent. The Congress, we implemented a number of reforms, but it's still going on. And I'm still involved in that to some extent. Now I'm representing, instead of the federal government, I'm representing the state of Virginia on a very meritorious claim.
Not ripping off.
You know, it was much tougher on the state. I was just going to add that those were complicated issues because even if you looked at even if it was clear that as a matter of law what the states were doing was in violation of the statutes and the regulations, they've gone through several rounds of congressional action. The question then became, how do you enforce the statute when you know as a practical matter, the result of that will be the states in many cases will have to cut back programs for low-income people and kids. And so the process of figuring out how to enforce the law in an effective manner is not an easy one. Daryl was amazing as a guide. I mean, I think this is sort of a lesson in my mind for all lawyer place. This constantly advising the policymakers about what the legal contour, what the decisions are, what the law requires, where the gray areas are, and how the process of interacting with the states ought to be conducted. Because you have to decisions make up. We're some legal and some were just hard decisions as to what you thought was the right thing to do. I'm glad to see you're still toiling in the figures.
There's decade. Our healthcare system has a lot of features in it that encourage utilization that's unnecessary. And so a lot of the controls that are put on things are tried to control utilization, but in fact that's except where you have a managed care system, a capitated payment made on behalf of the individuals. There's no control. So it's very difficult for the government to monitor the services that are being provided to determine whether they are medically necessary in all cases. But it's a continuing job. They get more sophisticated all the time. The areas where they're particularly subject to abuse in the medical, not devices, durable medical equipment, like the use of other things you'd have to buy because you have some medical condition and a supplier is supplying you who is not necessarily a professional. And there's been a lot of instances of organizations. These Florida seems to be right to this. They just set up a business in the garage and start building out this stuff. When the government tries to control this, for example, they have recently tried they spent 2 years developing competitive bidding for medical equipment. So you would no longer have your choice where to go to get your medical supplies. You have to go to a preferred supplier that was selected through competitive bidding. Congress said no. After the day that regulation was to go into effect, the Congress said put it on hold, and the result is the money keeps flowing. The other area of fraud and abuse that is problematic is the so-called anti-kickback laws. The federal government prohibits certain practices in the referral of medical services. You can't get paid anything. You can't take any remuneration if you refer someone for medical services, or if you self-refer in many cases to an entity in which you have a business. For example, a physician can't have a pharmacy. A lot of practices that are absolutely normal and accepted in the world other than the medical world are prohibited if you're working with Medicare or Medicaid. Just simple referrals and certain inducements, discounts can be illegal. So there's a whole raft of lawyers who have come into being to monitor these various schemes. As a result, they're trying to reduce the amount of fraud and abuse and money that's lost. I don't believe that it can, even if they were terribly effective, they could save the kind of money that was being talked about as being available to fund expansions of the healthcare system. Because believe me, the government has worked for years to try and reduce these practices.
I'd like to close with one last question to Linda. We've been talking mostly about the provision of medical care. Linda spent a good chunk of her career at the FDA worrying about foods. One program that I don't think most people are aware of, but it's very important, some of the international harmonization on food safety issues. Linda, I think, was our delegate to Codex for quite some time.
Yeah, I did. A number of people do this, but I did this for some of the Codex committees.
Why don't you talk a little about what Codex is and what role it plays in international public health?
The Codex Alimentarius Commission is the food standards program of the United Nations. The term Codex Alimentarius is in the Latin language, and it means food code. And I think that was kind of a compromise that it wasn't English or French. But it's basically it has two parents. One is the World Health Organization in Geneva, and the other parent is the Food and Agriculture Organization, or WUN, which is headquartered in Rome, and it alternates its meetings between those two cities. It used to have big meetings every 2 years. Now it's every 1 year. And then it has committees that do its work. And the purpose of Codex Alimentarius is to try to arrive at harmonized approaches to food, which additives are considered safe, which pesticides can be used, labeling should say, but hygiene requirements. This obviously has become very important with problems like the spinach and peppers and tomatoes and so forth. And the problem is, and I described my estimates at the level of harmonization that's been achieved in pharmaceutical testing. We haven't gotten nearly that far on food. I mean, most of our clients that are global food companies have to produce locally, formulate locally. It's really hard to sell products in multiple markets if you're talking about picky markets like the EU. The U.S. Consumer did not have a big concern about the development of biotech corn, biotech soy. People that wanted it would go to specialty supermarkets like Whole Foods and look for products that had been raised without these forms of technology. In Europe, it is said, because of distrust of government or perhaps people that are, as a population, are more risk averse. Some Europeans, not just John Steinbeck, but Europeans have speculated whether the risk-taking Europeans came to the New World and the risk-averse ones stayed in Europe, and so are still in Europe, genetically bred to be, more conservative, and those of us in the Americas, I think my 1634 was a draft dodger, but whatever. And he didn't want to go fight some stupid religious war on the continent. He came over here, and it's warmer. These sorts of things come up. But for whatever reason, to this day, it's really hard to sell in Europe products that are routinely on our supermarket shelf here because of sourcing requirements and a regime of requirements that are just as picky as FDA but different. And the other countries, certainly in Latin America, it's not as difficult. There we can produce evidence of products. If it's accepted in the U.S., it's a good chance it'll be allowed in Latin American countries because there's not the same degree of pickiness. South Africa, to know what the situation is. But so I would say, in some sense, Codex, if you compared Codex's achievements to those of ICH, the Pharmaceutical Harmonization Body, it's been less successful. But it has, I think the world would be much less harmonized if it had not been started back in 1962. Brings the regulators together so they talk, and there's a network of contacts of food regulators around the world so that they know whom to call when there's a crisis. There has been progress, even though there hasn't been as much progress as one might dream of in terms of having the same requirements. Why would anybody care about having the same requirements? One thing, the cost of regulation adds cost to every product. And as somebody who spent a lot of their life in regulation, I will defend it. It's a market correction tool because otherwise, the good companies who would do the right things without an FDA are unprotected from the people who would add melamine to baby milk. The people who just don't care and don't try. So good regulation is something that should be built into the price of the product. But there's no good reason to have unjustified differences, and so it's worthwhile to work toward harmonization. And as a compliance-oriented person, I would say, too, that the more harmonization there is, the more compliance there can be. Look at something like adverse event reporting in clinical trials or marketed products. Unjustified continued differences mean that when there is a need to report something, nobody can figure out what, when, how, because of the real but unjustified differences between markets.
And we import a hell of a lot of the produce that we eat, so
We sure do.
There's a self-interest.
We sure do, and I'm not
involved.
giving up my mangoes no matter where they come from.
So I have tons more questions to ask our panelists, but I don't want to shortchange the students. So, yes.
I have two questions.
Okay.
First, you talked about
Could you speak up just a little so your colleagues can hear you?
you talked about how regulation and information is so important and the unique role that FDA plays in all of this. I was wondering, why isn't there more of an emphasis on efficiency in addition to safety of drugs? Like, there are all these Me-Too drugs that are coming to the market. I think that they're adding a huge cost element to all of this. Why isn't there that? Why isn't that as much as emphasized as I think it might be? I think in Europe, perhaps.
Interesting. The general FDA view is that its job is to be a traffic cop and to let something come in if it's okay, and to block it only when there's something wrong with it. If it's not been shown safe, if it's not been shown effective, keep it off the market. But the FDA doesn't think it has the authority to stop large numbers of products. And I don't know if there's a market difference in the U.S. and Europe in this respect. I mean, I know for 3 years, and you go into a market looking for dental floss, just to give an ordinary example. And typical U.S. Drugstore, you have this much selection, right? All the different types and stuff. And big Belgian supermarket, one little container, And so I would think, but then you can go to the wine section. It's like 3 rows of wines, people leaving with nothing but wine.
Can I speak to that issue?
Better than Tylenol.
I've been working with a group from former secretaries of HHS and former administrators of CMS and academicians and so forth, who were working for the last 2 or 3 months to put together a report recommending changes to the way HHS administers our health programs. And this issue of efficiency or effectiveness of various things was the most controversial topic that came up in that group. Everybody had a different view about whether or not, everybody agreed we should promote effectiveness as an idea. But the disagreement came when we tried putting teeth into it. When people suggested, well, CMS should have a group that judges the efficiency or effectiveness of products and only pays for the most effective. And in fact, CMS has been trying to do that for some years, and that's one of the issues that we represent clients on all the time. Some of the Medicare carriers, the insurance companies, have what they call the least costly alternative policy. That if they think two treatments are identical, and one costs, in terms of effectiveness, and one costs more than the other, they'll only pay for the less expensive one. But in fact, the doctors will swear that there's the difference in the treatment. They're not the same chemical element. They have some differences. They've been shown to work better in particular patients, but yet these carriers won't pay for it. So this is a really big issue, and you're going to hear a lot more over the next few years.
Let me chime in as someone who worked on this from the consumer side when I was in my former life. You're not talking about new molecular entities. I mean, Me-Too drugs are not generic copies. They're different. And so, for example, the first anti-ulcer drug on the market was cimetidine. It basically ended ulcer surgery pretty much in the United States. It wasn't a great drug. It had side effects, and it had some, and there were a bunch of Me Too drugs that entered the market, chemically very close to cimetidine, but not the same copies. And ultimately, cimetidine got pushed aside, and the Me Too's ended up taking over a larger market share because they were safer and they were more effective. Talk to people with arthritis. They're the ones that I think Daryl's committee is hearing most about.
Subtle differences.
The subtle differences in drugs, and we're not talking necessarily about subtle differences. Sometimes they're pharmacologically more than subtle. The differences they make a huge difference. And when some of the COX-2 NSAIDs were withdrawn, Vioxx, Bextra were withdrawn, there are an awful lot of unhappy arthritis patients who can't tolerate aspirin because of the gastrointestinal bleeding, but need some relief from their arthritis. And so the question you're posing is actually a pretty complicated one. And I think the FDA's position, as I understand it, has been by and large that, yes, you can call them Me Too's, but each of them does have their own pharmacological profile that does warrant separate treatment.
Can I come in?
Sure.
And there's a particular, as there often is, a South African angle on some of these debates. And we're in the process at the moment of revising our Medicines Act, which sets up a drug regulatory authority. And government's putting in place a new regulatory authority, which is supposed to be more effective and more efficient. And one of the things which they did was to take the registration process, the drug approval process, and turn that into a two-stage process. This was the original bill that was tabled in Parliament by the former minister. So the first would be the authority itself would determine on the basis of quality, safety, and efficacy whether a product should be certified. And then there was a process that followed that, a political process by the minister on the basis of a range of criteria, some of which were particularly vague, to determine whether the product should be registered. And that then determines whether it's available at all to anyone in the country, regardless of whether you're getting your services through the public sector, which is 80% of the people, or through health insurance. And we were very concerned that was going to result in, particularly in the context of a history of state-sponsored AIDS denialism, in blocking certain good medicines from coming to market through the use of that kind of political power, and pushed very strongly and ultimately was successful. And the bills passed the lower house in getting that provision out. And we said there's certainly, in relation to reimbursement, to be a process where you determine which drugs get on the list, or which drugs are provided in the public health system and which ones are not. But that process needs to be completely divorced from the regulatory process, and that it's only questions of science that determine whether or not this drug should be on the market. And so for us, they were very. Some of the concerns that we had were, even though we recognized the importance of a process which determines what gets reimbursed and what doesn't, that you want to take that away from the regulatory process itself, because then you start injecting a whole range of kind of undue political interference into the regulatory process itself, and that's something we're trying to desperately guard against.
I should mention that in Europe, it's as you say, because the most new products in Europe, all biotech products and most new products are authorized in Europe under a purely scientific process, looking at safety and efficacy and quality, just like FDA. And then at member state level, there are decisions made about whether certain things get reimbursed or not. And that's a more political process. And that's where I think European drug access falls down in terms of having equal access to the same products that have been approved by the FDA. But then you look country by country, and who has access to the orphan medicines that it's very patchwork still in Europe.
Yeah, the British should have been criticized for that.
Yeah. They're
Especially
not-
they have a very,
Wait.
they have a high standard of effectiveness, and as a result, you've got myriad examples can be shown of people who are not getting treatment for something that would definitely would be given here without question.
Yeah, we had a pro bono, a woman in France to get care for her son. This was shortly after one of the landmark cases under the European treaties about cross-border health care. It's a very hot issue right now. Most people in Europe would not think about traveling outside their own countries, but you've had several examples of people that have, for one reason or another, sought health care someplace else. And generally speaking, they win all those cases in the European court. The European court consistently orders the person's country to pay the bill. Even the UK case, Mrs. Watts tried to get her hip replaced, and the National Health Service said, "You've got to wait, lady. It's not your turn. There's a list. Go on the list." Her doctor said, "You're really doing badly. You can't wait anymore. You go over to France." She goes over to France. She gets it done. She presents the bill to the National Health Service. They say, "Sorry, we don't do it this way. We're not a reimbursement agency. We direct you come and you get your hip." And case was litigated. The Court of Justice held the NHS must pay. This is a fundamental right of European citizens. So now it's being looked at. There's this fairly dreadful draft. But along the way, we helped a French mom get care for her son. We were trying at first to get him care in the U.S., but then it was discovered he could have the same treatment in Spain, and that was an easier swallow, even though there was a case involving getting care in Switzerland, which is a non-EU country. And so on that basis, we thought we could get a court-ordered reimbursement in the U.S., but it wasn't really necessary. It was much her to not have to travel from France to the U.S.
You had one more question.
Yes. I feel sort of frustrated with talking about, like, it just seems like there's so much gridlock. We passed, Medicare Part D, but we didn't give the state or the country bargaining power. SCHIP hasn't been increased in funding and so forth. And I'm wondering, it seems like, is it a proper way to look at this, sort of state regulation, or like with FDA preemption issues, just kind of work sort of on the state level, let them kind of be an alternative way of protecting the public health? What are your thoughts in that sort of general sphere?
Well, personally, I'm counting the days until the election and hoping for a good outcome.
Unlike the rest of the
But democracy is messy, and federalism is messy. I mean, some are a choice that our founders made in terms of a system that divides up power, and it doesn't work perfectly. The system that does.
And just from the Medicaid standpoint, where the states have a great deal of discretion how much you're going to pay, there's so much unevenness. If you're in California or New York or the District of Columbia, you probably have a pretty rich program. But if you're in Louisiana or Alabama or someplace out in the West, you're likely to have a very sketchy program. So there's been discretion given to the states to make the decision. That's not always worked well. It doesn't work if your goal is equality across the access to the whole population.
Can I add to that?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
We live under a very different kind of allocation of powers in South Africa, and in fact, it's the flip side of the states only have the powers that are expressly given to them under the Constitution. Health is a concurrent power between the national parliament and provincial parliaments, concurrent competence they have. But in practice, effectively how it works under the Constitution is that policy gets determined at a national level, implementation takes place at a provincial level. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, through funding, provinces don't have any power to tax themselves. All the taxes come from the central government and are allocated by quite a complex formula to provinces as what's known as the equitable share, and then also for specific priority programs, you have what's known as a conditional grant, which comes directly from national government to the province. And what that ultimately does is that it makes our lives a hell of a lot easier, because really the challenge is working at once you get the policy shifted at national level, provinces really just fall in line. So we had the benefit of our constitution is only 11 years old, so we didn't fall into the same trap. We don't have to try and find some novel way of working within the interstate commerce clause to try and get national government to regulate. It's widely accepted and it's quite clear on our really national government decides on how to regulate, and provinces don't have much scope to maneuver within.
See, he knows more about my country. Yes, because I did know that the FDA authorizes its power from interstate foreign commerce law.
There's a question. Yeah.
Earlier in the first segment, one of your roles was to monitor the conduct of global. And my question is, you also mentioned bringing litigation against some of the investigators, like the one who took his enrollment forms on the boat. And so my question is, a lot of these global trials that are either sponsored or co-sponsored by NIH that fall under INDs or NDAs, a tremendous responsibility falls on the sponsor and investigator. Cases like a quasi-natal study where you see investigators across multiple sites, multiple protocols, and you know the study coordinators or CRAs are the ones who are actually doing a lot of the work. How does that play out, and what is your opinion on the fact that the investigator so much really falls on a single investigator?
Well, that investigator is supposed to be getting monitored by the sponsor, and sponsors, drug companies, universities, whoever's paying for and directing the clinical trial, coming up with a protocol and so forth. Protocol is a plan for doing the study. They're either supposed to have their own staff that go out and do monitors, or they hire people, third parties, to come in and do monitoring. And that's where I think the system is falling down to some degree. And sometimes, and I think particularly with globalization, I think sometimes the doctors don't understand that the sponsor really needs to hear about adverse events. I mean, what good does it do anybody to learn about all this when the product gets in the market, and it's something you could have learned about earlier and kind of not continue the drug development. Did you have
I did have a follow-up question stemming from the debate that Professor Vladeck had about preemption. How do these protocol deviations, enrollment problems ultimately get found out about?
Sometimes, once there's a product liability case, they get found out about through the discovery process. I think, and Linda will correct me if I'm overstating this, but one of the problems is that the FDA does not have the resources to directly supervise and monitor essentially the supervision of clinical trials. And so there's been this growth industry of companies to certify that the trials are being conducted according to the protocol rigorously and so forth. And the real question is that an adequate substitute for having government actually be engaged in this oversight? If the FDA were a more richly resourced, I think one would argue that the FDA would engage in much more individual oversight, particularly now that the clinical trial process is truly a global one. But the FDA is stretched out. I mean, there are going to be 8 inspectors, food inspectors for all of China. And 1.6 billion people, 8 inspectors, that's 1 foot every 200 million.
Yeah.
It's just, there is an order scale here that and I don't know where we're going to turn for a regulatory model that enables more direct supervision. Maybe we're going to have to join forces with other regulatory agencies.
That's starting to happen now on the pharmaceutical good manufacturing practice area, because with the recognition that China and India alone are supplying a lot of the ingredients for pharmaceuticals used that are final dosage form all over the world, but certainly in the U.S. and Europe. And so, in response to the heparin episode,
I remember the raw ingredient was coming from China.
It's an essential pharmaceutical used in things like catheters and stuff, IV lines, so that your body doesn't sort of close up the opening and all that. And this is derived from pig intestines. And
Pictures of this being made, by the way.
no, it's really. I think where is needed? Why can't we come up with a recombinant version of heparin so we don't have intestines? It was done for insulin. The insulin needs to be derived from pigs, and now it's human recombinant. Isn't it better to have a biotech version of ourselves? But anyway, that's just me thinking. The FDA said, we can't do it all, and so finally there started to be some talk about international collaboration with European inspectors and Australian inspectors in particular to kind of share the task of inspecting ingredient suppliers from countries that have weak regulation.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but historically, Medicare has enjoyed a lot of the Medicaid. Do you think with the addition of S-chip that would change the tide on public opinion about Medicaid?
See, I don't know. Medicare had going for it that it was part of Social Security originally, and it was built on top of that, and that was already a well-accepted program, so it kind of slid in there very naturally. Whereas Medicaid has turned out topsy-turvy in the different states. And the it's the huge driver of state budgets, as you probably know. There's nothing that the states pay for that's more expensive than Medicaid. So that's going to prevent it from being as popular everywhere as Medicare is, because people don't see the budget cost of Medicare so much. So I don't see that S-chip is going to make that much difference in how politically acceptable program is to a given state, if that's the question.
Well, I was thinking basically people are a lot more sympathetic to Medicare because it's older and everyone wants that to be there. But I think Medicaid, a lot of the people perceive it as just people taking away money that they're earning. So I thought with S-chip, with children being involved, it would make people more sympathetic to this need.
Yeah, but I think you're still going to have, regardless of what practical level S-chip can get to, it's still going to be low-income people and people that are working and paying their own health insurance, like all those guys, taking my money for their programs when they're not working. I think that's always going to be a problem with Medicare. Time on days.
Daryl, I think. Right. I think actually in the Medicare will always be more popular without. I think one of the reasons why S-chip was created as a children's health program was an effort to pick, frankly, the most politically popular subgroup of low-income people, focusing on low-income kids. It's an area where people are more like a broader swath of the population is more likely to be more open to support, but it will never. That helps compared to traditional Medicaid, but that will never position the program to be as popular as Medicare. In my opinion.
I think we have time for one more question, and then people will stay around and answer questions. You've had your hand up, I think.
Yeah, I just was hoping that you could speak a little bit about the role of the private for-profit health in the administering of both Medicaid and Medicare, like how you see their role in taking money out of the system, and also just from a patient advocate perspective, it's very clear when they're involved. There's this line between state regulation of insurance companies, and when you get it through your employer, then it's preempted, and it's unclear what goes on when they jump into this arena. And I didn't know if you had thoughts about that.
I'm not sure I follow. You first talked about the private insurance companies in Medicare in administering Medicare and Medicaid?
Yeah, and kind of their influx into this through, I guess, Medicare. Like New York State, they've implemented using companies to do Medicaid.
There's two aspects of that. One is there are a number of managed care organizations that receive per capita amount for everybody can sign up in Medicare, and in Medicaid, most states have an option like that as well. There's a controversy about how much the government, what kind of the government pays to those insurance companies in order to get them to offer that kind of policy. It's fairly substantial, as I understand right now. It's like 10 or 15% over what it would cost Medicare to administer that on a fee-for-service basis. So that's kind of cutting that having managed care is going to reduce utilization to save money. So I'm yet to be convinced personally, but I think it takes a little bit because they've done a better job of managing the care. I don't know what the effect has been on consumers in the states. I know there's been some complaints that they're not getting what they're supposed to. But you know, Medicare was originally enacted with the idea that it was going to be administered like private health insurance. It was going to be, and it still is, administered through private. I give my Medicare checks or bills or explanations from somebody called Highmark or something. It's stayed that to a large extent. I personally think that the Part D program is out of control, but it's working. But I'm amazed it's working as well as it did, because with all those private insurers competing in there, I represent a couple of them. I guess they're doing all right. But I thought it was going to be a disaster. Let's see.
I think now has come the time to thank our panelists. I hope they'll stay around.
I want to invite our panelists and everybody. We have a little reception out back here if you want to come and get some cheese. So thanks, everybody. This is